Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 8 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 8. Question number 280. A pipeline builds an application container and deploys it to EKS. Configuration was changed to use resources in a new AWS account, and the pipeline reported success, but the running application still contains the previous backend configuration. Which mistake most directly explains the behavior? Option A. The new AWS account was not created even though its resources were tested. Option B. The deployment continued referencing the old image tag instead of a newly versioned image containing the configuration change. Option C. The developer pushed the image under a new tag. Option D. The developer added a distinct tag to the updated image. The correct answer is B. The deployment continued referencing the old image tag instead of a newly versioned image containing the configuration change. Here is why. If the workload specification still references the prior tag, EKS continues launching the image associated with the old application configuration despite a successful build pipeline. Why are the other options not correct? A. The scenario states that new account resources were tested successfully. C. Pushing and deploying a new tag is the expected immutable image workflow. D. A distinct tag helps the deployment identify the updated image. Exam tip. Publish immutable image tags and update the Kubernetes workload specification to the exact new tag or digest. Question number 281. An application on EC2 reads and writes objects in several specific S3 buckets. The application must receive temporary credentials automatically and must not have permissions for unrelated buckets. Which solution follows least privilege? Option A. Create an IAM user with S3** and store its keys on the instance. Option B. Attach the Amazon's 3 full access managed policy to an instance role. Option C. Put the EC2 instance ID in each bucket policy. Option D. Attach an instance profile whose role allows only required bucket level and object level actions on the named buckets. The correct answer is D. Attach an instance profile whose role allows only required bucket level and object level actions on the named buckets. Here is why. The instance role supplies automatically rotated temporary credentials, and its resource scoped policy grants only the necessary S3 operations. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM user keys are long-lived and S3* is excessive. B. Amazon's 3 full access violates least privilege. C. S3 resource policies grant access to IAM principals, not EC2 instance IDs. Exam tip. Use an EC2 instance profile with bucket and object ARN permissions instead of embedded access keys. Question number 282. An application creates PDF files larger than 1 MB and must encrypt them locally by using envelope encryption with a symmetric customer-managed KMS key. The files must be decryptable later without persisting plaintext key material. Which implementation is correct? Option A. Persist the plaintext data key and use the encrypted data key with a local cipher. Option B. Persist the plaintext data key and submit the encrypted data key to KMS encrypt for the file payload. Option C. Call generate data key, encrypt the PDF locally with the returned plaintext data key, and store the encrypted data key with the ciphertext. Option D. Use KMS encrypt to encrypt the complete PDF with the plaintext data key returned by generate data key. The correct answer is C. Call generate data key, encrypt the PDF locally with the returned plaintext data key, and store the encrypted data key with the ciphertext. Here is why. The plaintext data key encrypts the large file with a local symmetric cipher. The encrypted copy is persisted and later decrypted through KMS to recover the data key. Why are the other options not correct? A. Plaintext key material must not be stored. B. The encrypted key cannot directly encrypt the PDF in a local cipher. D. KMS encrypt is intended for small payloads and does not encrypt the large file with the returned plaintext key. Exam tip. Envelope encryption stores ciphertext plus an encrypted data key and erases the plaintext data key after use. Question number 283. The same CloudFormation template is deployed as separate stacks for development, test, and pre-production. The QA team must receive stack event notifications only for deployments to the final pre-production stack. Which solution requires the least custom code? Option A. Create a Cloud Watch alarm from non-existent CloudFormation deployment metrics. Option B. Subscribe QA to an SNS topic and configure the pre-production stack's notification ARNs. Option to use that topic. Option C. Configure a Lambda event source mapping for CloudFormation. Option D. Create a custom Lambda notifier and an event bridge rule when native stack notifications already meet the requirement. The correct answer is B. Subscribe QA to an SNS topic and configure the pre-production stack's notification ARNs option to use that topic. Here is why. CloudFormation natively publishes stack events to configured SNS topic ARNs, and only the selected pre-production stack needs that option. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudFormation does not expose the proposed stack status metric set. C. Event source mappings do not consume CloudFormation events. D. Event Bridge and Lambda can work but add unnecessary custom components. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation notification ARNs for native per stack SNS event notifications. Question number 284. 3 AWS accounts each contain an RDS database in private subnets. Database users must be created and later updated consistently through the infrastructure deployment process. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A. Declare database users as native CloudFormation RDS child resources. Option B. Run a permanent EC2 instance and database script in each account. Option C. Use one Lambda function with unrestricted network access to all 3 private databases. Option D. Add a Lambda-backed custom resource to a CloudFormation template and deploy the template in each account. The correct answer is D. Add a Lambda-backed custom resource to a CloudFormation template and deploy the template in each account. Here is why. The custom resource can connect to each private database and apply user changes during stack lifecycle events, while one template keeps the process consistent. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudFormation has no native resource for arbitrary database users. B. Permanent EC2 script hosts add operations and drift risk. C. One central function requires complex cross-account networking and permissions. Exam tip. Use a CloudFormation custom resource for imperative configuration that has no native resource type. Question number 285. Several teams depend on an API whose backend is not yet implemented. The company wants to publish callable API gateway endpoints that return predefined payloads and status codes without running Lambda or EC2. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use an HTTP_proxy integration and attach a Lambda layer. Option B. Create a Lambda function containing hard-coded responses and use AWS_proxy. Option C. Configure mock integrations, map request values to integration responses, and deploy the API to a stage. Option D. Run a mock HTTP service on EC2 and use an AWS integration. The correct answer is C. Configure mock integrations, map request values to integration responses, and deploy the API to a stage. Here is why. API Gateway can return predefined responses without invoking any backend, allowing dependent teams to develop against the published contract. Why are the other options not correct? A. HTTP_proxy needs a reachable HTTP backend, and layers do not attach to API Gateway. B. Lambda works but adds code and runtime operations. D. An AWS integration cannot use an arbitrary EC2 mock in the described way. Exam tip. API Gateway mock integrations are the lowest overhead backend substitute for early parallel development. Question number 286. A producer sends transaction updates to an SQS queue for a legacy consumer. Processing can take 5 minutes, updates must remain ordered, and an in-progress message must not become available to another consumer before processing completes. Which queue configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Use a standard queue with delay seconds on each batch entry. Option B. Use a FIFO queue and set the visibility timeout longer than the maximum processing time. Option C. Use a standard queue and increase only the visibility timeout. Option D. Use a FIFO queue and set only a delivery delay. The correct answer is B. Use a FIFO queue and set the visibility timeout longer than the maximum processing time. Here is why. FIFO preserves message group ordering, and a sufficient visibility timeout prevents another consumer from receiving an in-progress message. Why are the other options not correct? A. Standard queues do not guarantee order, and delay controls initial delivery only. C. Visibility timeout alone does not add ordering to a standard queue. D. Delivery delay does not protect a message throughout 5-minute processing. Exam tip. Combine FIFO message groups with a visibility timeout that exceeds the maximum consumer processing duration. Question number 287. A compute-intensive application stores sensitive working data on EBS volumes attached to EC2 instances. The volumes are created during deployment. All stored data must be encrypted, and encryption should not require application-level processing. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Move all application data to an encrypted S3 bucket. Option B. Write custom encryption and decryption logic in the application. Option C. Store the data on ephemeral instance disks from an AMI with only an encrypted root volume. Option D. Create and attach encrypted EBS volumes to the instances. The correct answer is D. Create and attach encrypted EBS volumes to the instances. Here is why. EBS encryption transparently encrypts data at rest, disk input-output, snapshots, and volume copies without application encryption logic or material performance impact. Why are the other options not correct? A. Moving the data changes the application storage architecture. B. Custom encryption consumes development effort and CPU. C. An encrypted root volume does not encrypt data written to unencrypted ephemeral disks. Exam tip. Enable EBS encryption when EC2 block storage must be encrypted transparently. Question number 288. A defect fix has been published as a new Lambda version. The team wants a stable production ARN to send 90% of invocations to the current version and 10% to the candidate version. Which configuration provides this rollout? Option A. Configure weighted routing on a Lambda alias that references the two published versions. Option B. Configure traffic weights on a Lambda trigger. Option C. Create a proxy integration that independently balances Lambda versions. Option D. Create a separate function and route an alias between two different function resources. The correct answer is A. Configure weighted routing on a Lambda alias that references the two published versions. Here is why. A Lambda alias provides a stable ARN and can route a specified percentage to one additional published version. Why are the other options not correct? B. Triggers do not own Lambda version traffic weights. C. Lambda proxy integration does not independently balance versions. D. Weighted aliases distribute between versions of one function, not separate functions. Exam tip. Use a weighted alias for a fixed canary split between two Lambda versions. Question number 289. A Lambda event source mapping reads from an SQS standard queue. Some messages are delivered more than once, and duplicate business updates must not be applied. Which solution is the most cost-effective? Option A. Limit the function to one concurrent invocation. Option B. Add a dead letter queue for all successfully processed messages. Option C. Replace SQS with Kinesis data streams. Option D. Make the consumer idempotent by recording a message or business operation identifier with a conditional write before applying the update. The correct answer is D. Make the consumer idempotent by recording a message or business operation identifier with a conditional right before applying the update. Here is why. SQS standard queues and Lambda event source mappings provide at least once processing, so idempotency prevents duplicate business effects. Why are the other options not correct? A. Serial execution does not prevent redelivery. B. A DLQ handles repeated failures, not successful duplicates. C. Changing services does not remove the need for idempotency. Exam tip. Assume queue consumers can receive duplicates and make side effects idempotent. Question number 290. An API gateway production stage invokes a pinned Lambda version. A new optimized version must receive a small percentage of requests through the same stage URL while the baseline deployment continues handling the remaining traffic. Which deployment workflow meets the requirement? Option A. Point the production integration to the new version and redeploy the entire stage with no canary. Option B. Create a second API gateway stage for the optimized version. Option C. Keep the baseline deployment pinned to the current version, create a new API deployment that invokes the optimized version, and attach it as a percentage-based canary on the production stage. Option D. Point a Lambda alias at $latest and use that alias as both the baseline and canary. Integration. The correct answer is C. Keep the baseline deployment pinned to the current version, create a new API deployment that invokes the optimized version, and attach it as a percentage-based canary on the production stage. Here is why. API gateway canary settings route a percentage to a separate deployment while preserving the existing production stage URL and baseline deployment. Why are the other options not correct? A. It sends all production traffic to the update. B. A second stage changes the stage URL. D. Lambda aliases cannot point to $latest, and using one integration for both paths does not create an API deployment canary. Exam tip. API gateway stage canaries test a new deployment through the existing production URL with a configurable traffic percentage. Question number 291. A SaaS vendor provides long-lived API credentials that are currently stored in plaintext. The application needs encrypted centralized storage and automatic quarterly rotation. Which solution is most secure? Option A. Encrypt the configuration file with KMS and rotate only the KMS key. Option B. Store the credentials in Secrets Manager and configure an appropriate quarterly rotation workflow. Option C. Request AWS STS credentials for the external SaaS API. Option D. Store the credentials in Parameter Store and enable a native automatic rotation feature. The correct answer is B. Store the credentials in Secrets Manager and configure an appropriate quarterly rotation workflow. Here is why. Secrets Manager encrypts the SaaS credential and can invoke custom rotation logic on the required schedule. Why are the other options not correct? A. Rotating a KMS key does not rotate the vendor credential inside the file. C. AWS STS issues AWS credentials, not third-party SaaS credentials. D. Parameter Store does not provide native automatic secret rotation. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager with custom rotation for third-party credentials that the external service permits the application to update. Question number 292. An authenticated web application runs on EC2 and provides downloads from a private S3 bucket with block public access enabled. Only signed-in application users should receive temporary access to individual objects, and the instances must not store long-term AWS keys. Which two changes meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Create an IAM user and copy its access keys to every EC2 instance. Option B. Attach an instance profile with the required S3 permissions to the EC2 instances. Option C. Return an internal S3 object handle to the browser. Option D. Generate time-limited S3 pre-signed URLs after the application authorizes each user. E. Delegate unauthenticated browser requests directly to the private bucket. The correct answer is B. Attach an instance profile with the required S3 permissions to the EC2 instances, D. Generate time-limited S3 pre-signed URLs after the application authorizes each user. Here is why. The role gives the application temporary AWS credentials, and pre-signed URLs grant each authenticated user limited time access to an authorized private object. Why are the other options not correct? A. Stored IAM user keys are long-lived. C. An internal object handle does not authorize an S3 download. E. Direct unauthenticated requests remain blocked and bypass application authorization. Exam tip. Authorize users in the application, then issue pre-signed URLs using credentials from the compute role. Question number 293. A Lambda function transcodes videos referenced by SQS messages. Long videos exceed the function's 15-minute timeout. The code cannot be changed, but the team can modify the function configuration to provide more compute resources. Which action is most likely to reduce execution duration? Option A. Increase the SQS visibility timeout only. Option B. Increase the size of the host that runs Lambda. Option C. Increase the Lambda memory setting to allocate more CPU. Option D. Enable application multi-threading without changing code. The correct answer is C. Increase the Lambda memory setting to allocate more CPU. Here is why. Lambda allocates CPU in proportion to memory. More CPU can shorten a compute-intensive transcoding operation without requiring code changes. Why are the other options not correct? A. Visibility timeout changes SQS redelivery behavior, not execution speed. B. Lambda has no customer selectable host instance size. D. Multithreading requires code changes and available CPU. Exam tip. For CPU-bound Lambda workloads, test higher memory settings because memory also increases CPU allocation. Question number 294. Front-end development is blocked because an API gateway REST API's backend is unfinished. The team needs predefined API responses immediately with the least operational work. Which solution should the developer use? Option A. Add a proxy resource without a backend. Option B. Create a Lambda function solely to return hard-coded payloads. Option C. Add unrelated endpoints that return temporary values. Option D. Configure API gateway mock integrations for the required methods. The correct answer is D. Configure API gateway mock integrations for the required methods. Here is why. Mock integrations return configured payloads and status codes directly from API gateway with no temporary backend to deploy or operate. Why are the other options not correct? A. A proxy resource still needs a backend integration. B. Lambda adds unnecessary code and runtime management. C. Extra endpoints do not provide the required method contracts by themselves. Exam tip. Use mock integrations to unblock front-end work while an API backend is under development. Question number 295. A company is validating its first AWS container deployment with a proof of concept. The team wants a managed image registry and serverless container compute with the least cluster and host administration. Which two steps should the developer take? Choose two. Option A. Build a container image and push it to Amazon ECR. Option B. Package the application as a zip file in S3. Option C. Deploy the zip package to EC2 with code deploy. Option D. Run the container as an Amazon ECS task on AWS Fargate. E. Create an EKS cluster on Fargate for the simple proof of concept. The correct answer is A. Build a container image and push it to Amazon ECR. D. Run the container as an Amazon ECS task on AWS Fargate. Here is why. ECR is the managed image registry, and ECS on Fargate runs the container without provisioning EC2 hosts or operating a Kubernetes control plane. Why are the other options not correct? B. A zip package is not the requested container artifact. C. EC2 plus code deploy requires server administration. E. EKS introduces Kubernetes configuration that is unnecessary for the proof of concept. Exam tip. ECR plus ECS Fargate is the simplest AWS native path for a small containerized application. Question number 296. A DynamoDB table contains an expiration date attribute. Expired items must be removed automatically, but their contents must first be available to a serverless archival process. The current application will be retired, and the replacement should require minimal code. Which design meets the requirement? Option A. Run 2 scheduled Lambda functions that scan, archive, and delete records. Option B. Send expired items directly to an SQS dead letter queue through DynamoDB TTL. Option C. Enable TTL on expiration date, enable DynamoDB streams, and invoke a Lambda consumer for TTL deletion records. Option D. Write separate Lambda functions that call delete item and manually pull the stream with get records. The correct answer is C. Enable TTL on expiration date, enable DynamoDB streams, and invoke a Lambda consumer for TTL deletion records. Here is why. TTL removes expired items automatically, and the stream contains service deletion records that Lambda can process to archive the old item image. Why are the other options not correct? A. Scheduled scans and deletes require substantially more code. B. TTL cannot target an SQS dead letter queue directly. D. Manual deletion and stream polling duplicate managed TTL and Lambda event source features. Exam tip. Combine DynamoDB TTL with streams when expired items must trigger downstream archival or cleanup. Question number 297. Several Lambda functions require shared read access to a machine learning library that is already 15 gigabytes and continues to grow. Where should the library be stored? Option A. In Lambda layers attached to every function. Option B. On an EFS file system mounted through access points by the functions. Option C. Inside a Lambda container image. Option D. In S3 and downloaded into each function/tmp directory for every execution. The correct answer is B. On an EFS file system mounted through access points by the functions. Here is why. EFS provides shared, scalable file storage that Lambda functions can mount and can hold a growing library far larger than package, layer, image, or /tmp limits. Why are the other options not correct? A. Layers count toward the 250 megabytes unzipped package limit. C. Lambda container images have a 10 gigabytes maximum size. D. Lambda ephemeral storage is limited and repeated downloads add latency. Exam tip. Mount EFS when many Lambda functions need low latency access to a very large shared dependency or dataset. Question number 298. A browser-based game needs managed user registration and sign-in. Authenticated users call Lambda-backed API gateway HTTP API routes. The team wants to avoid building and operating its own user directory and password database. Which solution has the least identity management overhead? Option A. Store usernames and passwords in DynamoDB and attach an IAM policy to the table. Option B. Create an RDS for SQL Server database for users and custom backend authorization. Option C. Create IAM groups and roles directly from the browser sign-in page. Option D. Use an Amazon Cognito user pool, optionally federate supported social IDPs, and use Cognito-issued tokens to authorize the API. The correct answer is D. Use an Amazon Cognito user pool, optionally federate supported social IDPs, and use Cognito-issued tokens to authorize the API. Here is why. Cognito user pools provide managed registration, authentication, password handling, and federation without operating a custom identity database. Why are the other options not correct? A. DynamoDB is not a managed user authentication service. B. RDS requires custom identity and password management code. C. Browser users should not create or manage IAM identities. Exam tip. Use Cognito user pools for application sign-up and sign-in. Use identity pools only when users need temporary AWS credentials. Question number 299. Images uploaded to S3 are reviewed by an external service. Audit results become available between 1 and 24 hours later and are keyed by the S3 object key. After a result is ready, The corresponding S3 object must be tagged automatically without running persistent servers or repeatedly scanning the entire bucket. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A. Start a step function standard workflow from the object created event, wait 24 hours. Then invoke Lambda to retrieve the result and tag the object. Option B. Put the object key in SQS and attempt to delay first delivery for 24 hours by setting the queue visibility timeout. Option C. Run a scheduled Lambda function that lists every untagged S3 object and calls the external API. Option D. Maintain an EC2 cron script that scans for untagged objects. The correct answer is A. Start a step function standard workflow from the object created event, wait 24 hours, then invoke Lambda to retrieve the result and tag the object. Here is why. A standard workflow durably waits without consuming compute and resumes once the audit's maximum completion window has elapsed. Why are the other options not correct? B. Visibility timeout begins after a message is received and does not delay initial delivery for 24 hours. C. Repeated full bucket scans add cost and duplicate work. D. EC2 cron requires persistent server management. Exam tip. Use step functions wait states for durable delays longer than queue delivery delay limits. Question number 300. A Lambda deployment package has grown because a large dependency changes much less often than the function code. Uploading the complete bundle for every code update now slows deployments. Which packaging change improves deployment speed? Option A. Increase the function memory allocation. Option B. Download all dependencies from S3 during each invocation. Option C. Put the stable dependency in a Lambda layer and deploy function code separately. Option D. Replace the deployment process with code deploy without changing package structure. The correct answer is C. Put the stable dependency in a Lambda layer and deploy function code separately. Here is why. The layer versions the large dependency independently, so code only updates upload and deploy a smaller function package. Why are the other options not correct? A. Memory affects runtime resources, not deployment package transfer. B. Runtime dependency downloads increase startup latency and operational complexity. D. Code deploy controls rollout but does not reduce package size. Exam tip. Put large, slowly changing shared dependencies in Lambda layers to reduce function package size and deployment time. Question number 301. A documentation site stores private static files in S3 and uses CloudFront with origin access control. Requests for/catalog/index.html succeed, but requests for catalog fail. The bucket must remain private, and directory style URLs should resolve to the index file. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Set index.html as the CloudFront default root object. Option B. Associate a CloudFront function with viewer requests that appends index.html when the request URI ends with a /. Option C. Configure a CloudFront 404 response to return the root/index.html file with status 200. Option D. Enable S3 website hosting and replace the private S3 origin with the public website endpoint. The correct answer is B. Associate a CloudFront function with viewer requests that appends index.html when the request URI ends with a /. Here is why. A viewer request function rewrites directory style paths before cache lookup and origin access, so the private OAC protected S3 origin receives the actual object key. Why are the other options not correct? A. The default root object applies only to the distribution root. C. It returns the root index page rather than the requested directory's index object. D. S3 website endpoints do not support OAC and normally require public website access. Exam tip. Use a CloudFront viewer request rewrite for pot to /path/index.html while keeping an S3 REST origin private. Question number 302. An API gateway REST API invokes Lambda for user authentication. The client submits the correct HTTP method and resource path but supplies invalid login credentials. Which HTTP status code should the application return? Option A, HTTP 503 service unavailable. Option B, HTTP 404 not found. Option C, HTTP 505 HTTP version not supported. Option D, HTTP 401 unauthorized. The correct answer is D, HTTP 401 unauthorized. Here is why. HTTP 401 indicates that the request lacks valid authentication credentials, which matches a login attempt with invalid credentials. Why are the other options not correct? A. 503 indicates temporary service unavailability. B. 404 indicates that the requested resource was not found. C. 505 indicates that the server does not support the request's HTTP version. Exam tip. Use 401 for invalid or missing authentication and 403 for an authenticated principal that lacks authorization. Question number 303. A developer in one AWS account must obtain temporary credentials to access a role in another account. The role's trust and authorization configuration requires MFA, and the developer must provide the MFA device serial number and token code to AWS STS. Which STS operation should the developer call? Option A, assume role. Option B, assume role with SAML. Option C, get federation token. Option D, assume role with web identity. The correct answer is A, assume role. Here is why. Assume role accepts serial number and token code parameters for MFA and returns temporary credentials for a trusted cross-account role. Why are the other options not correct? B. Assume role with SAML uses a SAML assertion. C. Get federation token creates a federated session for an IAM user and is not the standard cross-account role operation. D. Assume role with web identity uses an OIDC or web identity token. Exam tip. Use STS assume role with MFA parameters when a role's trust or permissions require an MFA authenticated session. Question number 304. An application running on EC2 needs permission to call specific S3 APIs. The solution must avoid long-term credentials stored on the instance. Which two actions provide the most secure configuration? Choose two. Option A, create an IAM user for the application and add the user to an IAM group. Option B, create an IAM role containing the required S3 permissions. Option C, assign an IAM role to an IAM group. Option D, store an IAM user's access key in EC2 environment variables. E, put the role in an instance profile and associate the instance profile with the EC2 instance. The correct answer is B, create an IAM role containing the required S3 permissions. E, put the role in an instance profile and associate the instance profile with the EC2 instance. Here is why. The role defines least privilege S3 permissions, and the instance profile delivers automatically rotated temporary credentials to the EC2 application. Why are the other options not correct? A, an IAM user introduces long-term credentials. C, IAM roles cannot be assigned to IAM groups. D, environment variables containing user keys require secret storage and manual rotation. Exam tip. EC2 applications should obtain temporary credentials from an instance profile role rather than embedded IAM user keys. Question number 305. A Lambda function needs read access to one S3 bucket and read/write access to one DynamoDB table. A least privilege IAM policy containing these permissions already exists. How should the developer grant the permissions to the function? Option A, create an IAM user, attach the policy, and place the user's access keys in environment variables. Option B, store root user access keys in encrypted environment variables. Option C, create a Lambda execution role, attach the existing policy to the role, and configure the function to use that role. Option D, attach the IAM permissions policy directly to the function without an execution role. The correct answer is C, create a Lambda execution role, attach the existing policy to the role, and configure the function to use that role. Here is why. Lambda assumes its execution role to obtain temporary credentials for calling S3 and DynamoDB with the policy's permissions. Why are the other options not correct? A. IAM user credentials are long-lived and should not be stored in function configuration. B. Root access keys must never be used by application code. D. A function receives identity-based permissions through its execution role. Exam tip. Attach downstream service permissions to the Lambda execution role. Use a resource policy when controlling who can invoke the function. Question number 306. A step function's task named fetchAsset invokes Lambda. Illegal argument exception must fail. The workflow immediately. Too many requests exception must cause exactly one retry after 10 seconds, and the workflow must fail if that retry also fails. Which state definition adds this behavior with the least complexity? Option A. Add a catch handler with interval seconds and max attempts fields and transition back to fetchAsset. Option B. Add a retry entry to fetchAsset for too many request exception with interval seconds set to 10 and max attempts set to 1. Option C. Duplicate fetchAsset and use a catch handler to transition to the duplicate. Option D. Add a wait state and loop through it from a catch handler. The correct answer is B. Add a retry entry to fetchAsset for too many requests exception with interval seconds set to 10 and max attempts set to 1. Here is why. The retryer handles only the throttling error, waits 10 seconds, and performs one retry. The unmatched illegal argument exception and a failed retry terminate execution. Why are the other options not correct? A. Catch does not support retry interval and attempt fields. C. Duplicating tasks adds unnecessary states. D. A manual loop is more complex than the native retry field. Exam tip. Use retry for transient step functions task errors and catch only when execution must transition to recovery logic. Question number 307. A CloudFormation template creates a CloudWatch logs log group and a Lambda function. The function needs the log group name at runtime. Which template change meets the requirement? Option A. Put the log group name in the template mapping section only. Option B. Add the log group's ARN to Lambda environment variables by using getAtt. Option C. Set a Lambda environment variable to ref the AWS logs log group resource. Option D. Pass the value through EC2 user data. The correct answer is C. Set a Lambda environment variable to ref the AWS logs log group resource. Here is why. Ref returns the log group name, which CloudFormation can inject into the function configuration for runtime use. Why are the other options not correct? A. A mapping does not automatically expose a value to Lambda. B. getAtt returns the ARN rather than the requested name. D. Lambda does not use EC2 user data. Exam tip. Use ref when a CloudFormation resource returns the physical name required by the application. Question number 308. A developer creates a DynamoDB table through the AWS CLI. The table must use DynamoDB's AWS-owned key for server-side encryption. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Create an AWS-managed KMS key and pass its ARN as KMS master key ID. Option B. Create a customer-managed KMS key and pass its ARN as KMS master key ID. Option C. Create an AWS-owned key manually and pass its ARN to the CLI. Option D. Create the table with DynamoDB's default encryption settings. The correct answer is D. Create the table with DynamoDB's default encryption settings. Here is why. DynamoDB encrypts every table at rest, and its default encryption type uses an AWS-owned key managed in the DynamoDB service account. Why are the other options not correct? A. An AWS-managed key is stored in the customer's account and is not the default AWS-owned key. B. A customer-managed key is created and controlled by the customer. C. Customers cannot create or reference the ARN of an AWS-owned key. Exam tip. DynamoDB default encryption uses an AWS-owned key, Select a KMS key only when account-level key control is required. Question number 309. A distributed application runs in several AWS regions. The team wants to filter X-ray traces by region to identify where intermittent latency originates. AWS service trace data already includes regional information, but custom application segments need equivalent searchable data. What should the developer do? Option A. Configure the X-ray daemon to create annotations for every AWS and custom service. Option B. Use the X-ray console to retroactively add annotations to stored trace segments. Option C. Use the region annotation that X-ray provides for AWS services and add a region annotation to user-defined service segments. Option D. Assume custom services receive a region annotation automatically and configure one only for AWS services. The correct answer is C. Use the region annotation that X-ray provides for AWS services and add a region annotation to user-defined service segments. Here is why. Regional metadata for AWS service nodes can be used in traces, while custom segments need an indexed annotation if the team wants consistent region-based filtering. Why are the other options not correct? A. The daemon transports segment documents and does not invent application annotations. B. The console cannot retroactively modify stored segments. D. User-defined segments do not automatically receive arbitrary application annotations. Exam tip. Add indexed X-ray annotations to custom segments for attributes that must be used in trace filter expressions. Question number 310. One Lambda function consumes two SQS queues. The team wants separate concurrency ceilings of 10 for the high-volume queue and 90 for the secondary queue, while ensuring the two mappings cannot exceed 100 concurrent invocations in total. Which event source configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Set batch size to 10 and 90. Option B. Set maximum concurrency to 10 and 90 on the respective event source mappings. Option C. Set maximum batching window to 10 and 90 seconds. Option D. Set delivery delay to 0 and 10 seconds. The correct answer is B. Set maximum concurrency to 10 and 90 on the respective event source mappings. Here is why. Maximum concurrency independently caps how many concurrent Lambda invocations each SQS mapping can use, and the two caps sum to 100. Why are the other options not correct? A. Batch size controls messages per invocation. C. Batching windows control collection time. D. Delivery delay controls initial message availability. Exam tip. Event source maximum concurrency caps scaling per SQS mapping. It does not create strict priority scheduling. Question number 311. Applications run in development, staging, pre-production, and production. Each environment has different sensitive credentials. The values must be encrypted and support automatic rotation without treating environment values as historical versions of one credential. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A. Create a separate secrets manager secret for each environment and configure rotation for each secret. Option B. Store every environment's value as a different version of one secrets manager secret. Option C. Put the credentials in application environment files with environment-specific names. Option D. Store environment credentials as versions of one parameter. Store parameter and enable automatic rotation. The correct answer is A. Create a separate secrets manager secret for each environment and configure rotation for each secret. Here is why. Each environment has an independent credential lifecycle, permissions, and rotation state. Separate secrets preserve this isolation and support automatic rotation. Why are the other options not correct? B. Secret versions represent the lifecycle of one secret, not independent environment credentials. C. Application files do not provide managed encryption and rotation. D. Parameter versions are historical revisions and parameter store has no native automatic secret rotation. Exam tip. Use separate secret resources for separate environments. Use versions and staging labels during one secret's rotation lifecycle. Question number 312. Lambda pulls an SQS standard queue and sends an SES email for each message. During traffic spikes, some recipients receive the same email more than once. Which two conditions can cause this behavior? Choose 2. Option A. SES DKIM is configured incorrectly. Option B. The SES bounce rate metric is high. Option C. Standard SQS queues provide at least once delivery. Option D. Standard SQS queues provide exactly once processing. E. The queue visibility timeout is less than or equal to the Lambda function timeout. The correct answer is C. Standard SQS queues provide at least once delivery. E. The queue visibility timeout is less than or equal to the Lambda function timeout. Here is why. Standard queues can deliver duplicates, and an insufficient visibility timeout can make a message visible again while the first Lambda invocation is still running. Why are the other options not correct? A. DKIM affects email authentication, not duplicate queue processing. B. Bounce metrics do not cause duplicate sends. D. Standard queues do not provide exactly once processing. Exam tip. Make SQS consumers idempotent and configure visibility timeout longer than the maximum processing period. Question number 313. An EC2 application generates gigabytes of files each day. The files are rarely read, but during their first year users require access within minutes. The data must remain stored for 7 years at the lowest cost. Which storage design best meets the requirement? Option A. Store the files on EFS and move them to EFS standard IA after 1 year. Option B. Store the files in S3 Glacier instant retrieval, then use an S3 lifecycle rule to move them to S3 Glacier deep archive after 1 year. Option C. Store the files in S3 standard and transition them only to S3 Glacier flexible retrieval after 1 year. Option D. Store the files on EBS and retain data lifecycle manager snapshots for 7 years. The correct answer is B. Store the files in S3 Glacier instant retrieval, then use an S3 lifecycle rule to move them to S3 Glacier deep archive after 1 year. Here is why. Glacier instant retrieval provides millisecond access for rarely read data during year 1, and deep archive minimizes storage cost for the remaining retention period. Why are the other options not correct? A. EFS is a higher cost shared file system for this object archive workload. C. S3 standard costs more during the rarely accessed first year, and flexible retrieval is not the lowest cost long-term tier. D. EBS volumes and snapshots add block storage cost and management. Exam tip. Match S3 storage classes to both access latency and access frequency, then use lifecycle transitions as data ages. Question number 314. A CloudFormation stack creates parameter store parameters, but the application also updates their values at runtime. Later stack updates restore the template values and overwrite the application's changes. Other resources in the stack must continue to be updated normally. Which change requires the least development effort while protecting those parameters from stack updates? Option A. Add deletion policy, retain to the parameters. Option B. Replace parameter store with an RDS configuration database. Option C. Replace parameter store with a DynamoDB configuration table. Option D. Apply a stack policy that denies update actions for the parameter store resources. The correct answer is D. Apply a stack policy that denies update actions for the parameter store resources. Here is why. A stack policy can protect selected resources from CloudFormation update actions while permitting updates to the remaining stack resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. Deletion policy controls resource deletion, not updates that overwrite a value. B. RDS adds substantial schema and database operations. C. DynamoDB requires application migration and additional code. Exam tip. Use a CloudFormation stack policy to prevent updates to protected stateful resources while allowing the rest of the stack to evolve. Question number 315. A high-traffic application stores rapidly changing, complex social data in RDS read. Latency must be minimized, and updates should immediately refresh the cache so readers do not repeatedly receive stale values. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Add elastic cache for RED-ISS and implement a write-through caching strategy. Option B. Put CloudFront directly in front of the RDS database. Option C. Use DAX as a cache for the RDS database. Option D. Enable S3 transfer acceleration for database responses. The correct answer is A. Add elastic cache for RED-ISS and implement a write-through caching strategy. Here is why. RED-ISS provides low-latency access to complex cached values, and write-through logic updates the cache as the RDS data changes. Why are the other options not correct? B. CloudFront is not a direct database cache. C. DAX is designed for DynamoDB, not RDSD. S3 transfer acceleration applies to S3 object transfers. Exam tip. Use elastic cache for database query caching and choose an invalidation or write-through strategy that matches data change frequency. Question number 316. A Lambda function already contains supported X-ray or OpenTelemetry instrumentation for its downstream AWS SDK calls, but active tracing is disabled. The team must investigate which service dependency is adding latency without changing the application code. Which action meets the requirement? Option A. Enable Lambda active tracing and inspect the resulting X-ray traces and service map. Option B. Review AWS config history. Option C. Use Cloud Trail Management events as distributed traces. Option D. Review only the function's plain CloudWatch log messages. The correct answer is A. Enable Lambda active tracing and inspect the resulting X-ray traces and service map. Here is why. With instrumentation already present, active tracing records downstream subsegments and exposes service-to-service latency without changing the code. Why are the other options not correct? B. Config tracks resource configuration. C. CloudTrail audits AWS API activity. D. Plain logs do not automatically correlate dependency latency. Exam tip. X-ray needs tracing enabled and downstream instrumentation to expose dependency timing. Question number 317. A company must quickly migrate containerized Kubernetes workloads from on-premises data centers. Every workload currently mounts the same NFS share, and the replacement platform must provide highly available managed Kubernetes and shared file storage. Which two actions meet the requirements? Choose two. Option A. Move the NFS data to 1 EBS volume and push container images to ECR. Option B. Move the NFS data to Amazon EFS and push the container images to Amazon ECR. Option C. Run the containers on ECS and attach the same EBS volume to every node. Option D. Create an EKS cluster and mount EBS as one shared read-write-many file system. E. Create an EKS cluster and expose the EFS file system to pods through the EFS CSI driver. The correct answer is B. Move the NFS data to Amazon EFS and push the container images to Amazon ECR. E. Create an EKS cluster and expose the EFS file system to pods through the EFS CSI driver. Here is why. ECR stores the container images, EKS provides managed Kubernetes, and EFS supplies highly available shared NFS-compatible storage to multiple pods. Why are the other options not correct? A. 1 EBS volume is not a multi-node shared NFS replacement. C. ECS does not preserve the stated Kubernetes platform, and EBS cannot be mounted this way across all nodes. D. EBS is generally node and availability zone oriented rather than shared read-write-many storage. Exam tip. Use EKS with the EFS CSI driver when Kubernetes workloads require shared NFS-compatible persistent storage. Question number 318. A Lambda function processes transactions through asynchronous invocation. When an event still fails after the configured retries, a second Lambda function must receive the failure details and perform error handling. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Create a CloudWatch alarm that passes the failed invocation payload to the second function. Option B. Configure a Lambda trigger with an on-failure condition. Option C. Configure an asynchronous Lambda destination for failures and set the second function as the destination. Option D. Enable X-ray and configure it to invoke the second function with stack traces. The correct answer is C. Configure an asynchronous Lambda destination for failures and set the second function as the destination. Here is why. An on-failure destination receives an invocation record after asynchronous processing exhausts retries and can invoke the error-handling Lambda function. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudWatch alarms do not carry the original invocation record as a failure destination. B. Lambda triggers do not define asynchronous failure routing. D. X-ray records traces but is not a failed event routing service. Exam tip. Use Lambda destinations when asynchronous success or failure records must be routed to another service or function. Question number 319. A new capability should be available only to selected premium users. The team needs to validate configuration changes and safely turn the capability on or off without redeploying application code. Which service and feature should the developer use? Option A. Parameter store lifecycle rules. Option B. AWS config rules. Option C. Secrets manager lifecycle policies. Option D. AWS app config feature flags with validators and controlled deployment. The correct answer is D. AWS app config feature flags with validators and controlled deployment. Here is why. App config supports targeted feature flags, configuration validation, gradual deployment, monitoring, and rapid rollback without a code deployment. Why are the other options not correct? A. Parameter store does not provide the stated feature flag deployment controls. B. AWS config evaluates AWS resource configuration compliance. C. Secrets manager manages secrets rather than feature releases. Exam tip. Use app config feature flags to change application behavior safely and independently of code deployment. Question number 320. A code pipeline release must pause before production until a product owner approves it. An SNS topic already exists for approval notifications. The deployment action must not run in parallel with the approval action. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A. Add only a pipeline notification rule without an approval action. Option B. Add a separate stage before production, place a manual approval action in that stage, and notify the existing SNS topic when approval is required. Option C. Build a step functions approval workflow and add it as a custom pipeline action. Option D. Put the manual approval action in the same stage as the production deployment action. The correct answer is B. Add a separate stage before production, place a manual approval action in that stage, and notify the existing SNS topic when approval is required. Here is why. Code pipeline pauses at the approval stage and cannot enter the later production stage until the product owner approves the action. Why are the other options not correct? A. A notification alone does not block deployment. C. Step functions adds unnecessary workflow code. D. Actions in one stage can run in parallel, so approval might not precede deployment. Exam tip. Put a manual approval action in its own stage immediately before the deployment stage. Question number 321. A step functions workflow invokes several Lambda functions. One task occasionally fails with a Lambda timeout during peak load, and the workflow must automatically retry that task according to a defined retry limit. Which state machine configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Add a retry field to the task and specify the timeout error plus the retry policy. Option B. Add a fail state with a retry attempt property. Option C. Add only a timeout seconds field to the task. Option D. Publish the request to SNS and implement retries in another Lambda function. The correct answer is A. Add a retry field to the task and specify the timeout error plus the retry policy. Here is why. Step functions task retriers match named errors and define attempt count, delay, and back off without adding extra workflow states. Why are the other options not correct? B. A fail state terminates execution and has no retry policy. C. Timeout seconds limits task duration but does not retry failures. D. SNS and another function add unnecessary components. Exam tip. Configure retry on a step functions task for recoverable errors and reserve catch for alternate workflow paths. You have completed Part 8 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.